I wanted to give you a few additional thoughts and ideas about system responses to supplement the reading that you're doing in this week and have covered in previous weeks as well. Most of this material comes from the Barnett text, Family Violence Across the Lifespan, and from the Bancroft and Silverman book, The Batterer as Parent. There is a gap in legal resources and very inadequate resources in the criminal justice system to deal with matters of intimate partner violence. Sanctions that are applied oftentimes in those situations are often inadequate when they're applied. First of all, the system doesn't offer adequate legal resources for victims. Oftentimes, victims are unable to afford legal representation and are at a real handicap if they go to court without an attorney. However, there is a National Domestic Violence Pro Bono Directory that might help victims find legal representation, and I would suggest that victims contact the local Women's Resource or Shelter Services Center for ideas about who might be of some assistance in those cases. Protective orders have become more available to victims over the years, but there's a question about whether or not they're effective in the long run. And sometimes the courts are reluctant to enforce them once they're applied and if they're violated. There is some movement to putting permanent protective orders in place, but at the present time, in most situations, the victims may be able to get an emergency temporary restraining order that is good for 90 days and then must go back to court, in Alaska at least, and testify as to the reasons for an extended protective order, and generally, if they're granted, they only are good for a year or so. Serving protective orders can be problematic in about a third of the cases. One California study suggested the judges often don't adhere to sentencing mandates, and I say that below as well. Protective order violation rates can be close to 50%. Judges often don't arrest violators when they do not comply with the protective order, and this, of course, makes them rather ineffective. But still, 80% of the women involved after protective orders have been issued say that they did reduce violence. Weapons are more likely to be used by women in domestic violence cases, but in any event, it is illegal for any person convicted of a crime related to domestic violence to carry or possess a weapon. That's a federal offense. In the past, family violence was trivialized by law enforcement as non-injurious, inconsequential, and a private family matter. Police, when they did respond, would send the abuser out for a walk around the block, and then they talked to the woman while the abuser was out of the home about what she can do to avoid harm in the future and how she can avoid upsetting her man as much as she did. We've come a long way since those days, in most situations at least, and in fact, law enforcement have come to see domestic violence as a murder in progress, as it was once described by a trooper commander that I knew. And so they take things more seriously. Officers also understand that responding to domestic violence calls are sometimes among the most dangerous situations that they can find themselves in. And from time to time, you're going to hear of stories where law enforcement officers are severely injured or killed while responding to domestic violence calls. There are certain beliefs that officers have that sometimes may make them reluctant to make an arrest. For instance, that male assaults are the victim's fault, that they're justified. That if he beats her and she stays, she's really not a victim. That battered women manipulate and oftentimes are not believable. That police involvement is not the best way to stop intimate partner violence. And that responding to domestic violence calls isn't really police work. As I mentioned a few moments ago, intervening in partner violence is sometimes the most dangerous form of police work. But since 1997, Alaska law requires that if there is an injury in a case involving intimate partner violence, the police must make at least one arrest. There has been evidence that police have used a double standard in determining probable cause for arrest when deciding what to do about assaults involving strangers and assaults involving domestic violence. At times, police have failed to arrest batterers that have used lethal weapons or have done such dangerous things as throwing female partners down the steps and so on. This has led to the establishment of those mandatory arrest protocols. There's been studies that show that there's a 30% decrease in violence after an arrest in a relationship and 60% drop in a 6-month follow-up. So calling in the domestic violence calls and those arrests actually do make a difference. Mandatory arrest policies do not consistently exert a deterrent effect, however, and Studies have shown that some police resist the policies of mandatory arrest, and other studies has indicated that there's been an increase in the arrest of females when many of the women involved who have been arrested were actually victims defending themselves. Because of that, some states now have enacted laws to mandate the arrest of the primary aggressor only in these situations. Sometimes when victims do call the police, they don't want their batterer arrested, and there's a number of different reasons for that. But because of the reluctance of some victims to testify, there are states that have established mandatory no-drop policies which prevent victims from recanting their complaints. Male batterers tend to be offered significantly shorter sentences than perpetrators of other violent crimes. But about a third of the reported offenses and 3/5 of the arrests resulted in prosecution, and more than half of those charged were subsequently convicted. Some states, and this does include Alaska, consider intimate partner violence as a crime against the state, so prosecution can proceed even if the victim declines to do so. So that is a significant barrier to the prosecution of intimate partner violence cases that has been overcome. Female victims a lot of times are reluctant to testify for any number of reasons. Of course, one of the more obvious ones is fear of retaliation by the abuser. Batterers re-abuse before the trial in as many as half the cases. Lack of sufficient and tangible victim support is another barrier. Lack of preparation for testifying, which is a part of that support. Either prosecutors lack the time to do so, or there aren't advocates that are available to help the individual prepare for the trial. Victims worry that she won't be believed, and they fear the abuser won't be found guilty. Sometimes victims are dependent on the abuser for finances, housing, and so on. And so, of course, testifying against the abuser sometimes can work at cross purposes for their own safety needs. And there are times when they just don't get informed of court dates. There was a study that indicated that about 3/4 of the attorneys in IPV cases said that judges allow inappropriate questions of victims on the stands. And there is such a variation in judicial sentencing. At times, judges are found to not follow sentencing guidelines. Oftentimes, they don't consider perpetrators' criminal histories in doing so. There was one study, however, that said that intrusive dispositions in IPV cases are helpful in deterring re-abuse. Intrusive dispositions including such things as jail time, work release, electronic monitoring, probation, and so on. The comparison was, in these cases, less than a quarter of these cases resulted in re-abuse versus 60% in a control group where intrusive dispositions were not applied. Part of the problem is that judges are at times inadequately trained in male to female intimate partner violence, and this is a problem for the victims in the cases that come before them. Why don't victims leave? This is the question that's often posed, and rather than looking at why the batterers batter, why do the victims return to the batterers? And some of the barriers to leaving include such things as the partner's promise to change, the partner's apology. These are all a part of that cycle of abuse that I talked about several weeks ago in class. A lack of funding and an inability really to support themselves apart from the batterer, and having nowhere to go. In addition to these individual factors, there are influences that are impediments on a larger scale that include such things as the social environment, family and social role expectations, and the psychological impact of the abuse. Those who did leave tend to be younger. They have a protective order generally. They have perhaps left the relationship previously. They're vulnerable psychologically. They saw a physician because of the abuse, and so therefore there were injuries that were serious enough to require some medical attention. They had little or no childhood abuse themselves, so there isn't that history, that baggage that they're carrying around with. And they obtain external supports. And external supports, whether it be friends or shelters or transitional housing, employment, whatever it might be, these things are vital for individuals trying to leave an abusive situation. There is that pressure in society to stay with your partner no matter what because of such things as ideas of love, hope, and commitment. Shelter services makes it possible for battered women to leave, but the studies are contradictory as to whether the presence of physical assaults were a major factor in that decision to leave. It's one factor as escalation in assaults, but really what seems to be more closely associated with leaving is being dissatisfied with the violence. You have to consider that individuals may be accustomed to physical assaults, perhaps to a certain extent, but there's a point where they're no longer okay with it happening. They become dissatisfied with the situation, and that's when they decide to leave. Psychological abuse is another factor which is associated with increasing the likelihood of leaving. And we know that psychological abuse is one of the major forms of abuse and intimate partner violence. But women are often entrapped in these relationships by poverty, by their religious beliefs, by financial dependence, by the family and the family's role expectations, and so on. Of course, many of these women also worry about what will happen with the children if they do leave and whether they'll be able to keep custody. On average, though, women leave and return to their abusers 5 to 6 times before they decide to leave for good. Why do they stay? Abuse may stop when the woman leaves, but leaving itself doesn't guarantee her safety. To leave can be dangerous, if not fatal. They may decide to stay because it's safer to do so. Assault victimization rates of women separated from husbands was 3 times higher than those of a divorced woman and 25 times higher than a married woman. 3/4 of the women who were killed by their male partners and 85% of those severely beaten had left or tried to leave during the previous year. So for some victims, the decision is not whether to leave, but whether to live. Women understand, whether they're aware of the statistics or not, they understand the danger that is involved in leaving an abusive partner. Economic dependence, low income, poverty, all of these factors are highly associated with male to female IPV and child abuse, and this prevents many women from leaving. It causes women to return to the batterer, and other such factors as lack of housing, financial resources, lack of credit cards, childcare, transportation, all these things make it difficult for women to be able to establish an independent household. So shelters have saved many women's lives, and one of the things that they do is emphasize safety planning for female abuse victims who are planning to leave their abusers. Of course, victims often reach out to women's shelters before they actually leave, and staff are trained to help victims learn how to establish and develop and utilize a safety plan. And the Peterson text does a very good job of demonstrating some of the examples of safety plans and what can be involved in them. And women who access shelter services are more likely to leave abusive relationships. And so if you're aware of a person engaged in IPV, one of the things that you can do to help is to encourage that individual to reach out to a shelter facility. Transitional housing associated with shelters acknowledge that family violence is one of the major causes of female homelessness as well. So transitional housing exists and sometimes will permit women who are no longer in need of the safety of shelter to be able to find a place to land and live for a period of time in a semi-supervised setting in order to help them get their feet on the ground and establish some independence away from the abuser. Affordable permanent housing is a barrier for female victims and is one of the reasons why they return to the abuser if adequate housing isn't available for themselves and their children. As we've talked about before in Bancroft and Silverman's The Batterer as Parent, oftentimes victims worry that the batterer is going to be successful in getting the children removed from the victim or to gain custody of the children in subsequent proceedings to the victim leaving the family. Bancroft and Silverman discuss how batterers are very successful in using the custody litigation process to further abuse their victims. They are very good at convincing custody investigators, child protection workers, mediators, judges, social workers, and other interveners, including law enforcement, that they're the better parent, pointing oftentimes to the emotional and financial problems that their victims are left with as the result of the abuse, as a demonstration of the victim's inadequacy as a parent. So it's very careful that we not allow ourselves to get caught in that trap of misunderstanding. And also be aware that the children in these situations, for reasons that we've discussed earlier in this course as well, will sometimes choose to go with the batterer. And this is also another consideration in the woman's decision to stay in the relationship. So hopefully These points will further your understanding of why it is sometimes victims are trapped in battering situations and may give you some clues as to how to go about helping them get on their feet and away from those situations. Thank you.